Officer Daniel Mercer and Priya Sharma crossed paths in silence and secrecy, but as Valentine's Day approached, a hidden relationship built on power and trust began to unravel, setting off a chain of events that would turn a trusted badge into the center of a deadly mystery. At 58 years old, the police officer had built a life that looked complete from the outside. His uniform carried decades of authority, and his presence alone was enough to calm tense situations. Neighbors greeted him with respect, and younger officers often looked to him for guidance. His career had survived scandals, policy changes, and long nights on patrol. To the city, he was reliable and disciplined, a man who understood the line between right and wrong better than most. Away from the station, his life followed strict routines. Mornings began early, evenings ended quietly, and nothing about his behavior suggested chaos. Yet beneath that structure lived a growing restlessness. Years of power and control had slowly reshaped how he saw relationships. He was used to being obeyed, used to being trusted without question. That sense of control followed him beyond the badge and into his private choices. She entered his life quietly, without ceremony. A young Indian immigrant, she had arrived with little more than determination and hope. Everything about her world felt unfamiliar. The language, the systems, the cold distance of a city that never slowed down. She worked long hours, sent money home when she could, and tried to stay invisible. Loneliness followed her everywhere, settling into her days like a shadow. Their connection began through circumstance rather than intention. He noticed her vulnerability before he noticed anything else. To him, she represented youth and admiration, something untouched by his long history. To her, he represented safety. His age, his job, and his confidence made her feel protected in a place where she often felt lost. Trust formed quickly, not because it was earned, but because it felt necessary. As the relationship grew, it remained hidden. Meetings were carefully planned, always away from familiar places. He controlled the timing, the location, and the limits. She accepted this arrangement, believing secrecy was temporary. Each encounter reinforced her belief that patience would lead to stability. She did not see the imbalance clearly at first. His authority blurred into affection, and his caution felt like care. For him, the secrecy was essential. Exposure meant humiliation, the loss of a reputation built over decades, and consequences he had avoided his entire career. What began as excitement slowly turned into anxiety. Every phone notification felt dangerous. Every unexpected question felt like a threat. The relationship that once gave him escape now demanded constant management. As Valentine's Day approached, the tension deepened. She began to expect acknowledgement, something that proved she mattered beyond hidden moments. For her, the date symbolized hope and reassurance. For him, it symbolized risk. The gap between what they wanted widened quietly, without confrontation, without clear resolution. He stood at a crossroads shaped by fear rather than emotion. One path required honesty and loss. The other promised silence and control. Years of enforcing the law had taught him how systems worked, how evidence disappeared, and how narratives were shaped. As the holiday drew closer, the decision forming in his mind was no longer about love or desire. It was about preservation, and how far he was willing to go to protect the life he had built. The imbalance in their relationship became more pronounced with each passing week. What had once felt like guidance slowly transformed into restriction. He decided when they would meet, how long the time would last, and when communication would end. If days passed without contact, she was expected to accept it without question. His authority made these limits feel non-negotiable. She told herself this was the cost of being involved with someone whose life carried responsibilities and risks. Her dependence grew quietly. Being far from home meant she relied on him not only emotionally, but practically. He offered help with paperwork, advice about navigating systems, and occasional financial support. Each gesture strengthened her trust while tightening his influence. She felt grateful even when discomfort crept in. Saying no felt impossible. Losing him meant losing the only sense of stability she had found. The officer's mindset was shifting in a different direction. What once felt manageable now felt fragile. He worried constantly about mistakes, about small details slipping out of control. His experience taught him that exposure rarely came from dramatic events but from minor inconsistencies. He began to see her not as a partner, but as a variable he could not fully predict. That uncertainty unsettled him deeply. As Valentine's Day approached, pressure intensified. She wanted clarity. The relationship could not remain hidden forever in her mind. The idea of being acknowledged, even in a small way, gave her hope. For him, the same date represented danger. Public attention, expectations, and emotional demands collided with his fear of consequences. The holiday sharpened the contrast between them. He began preparing in quiet ways. His routines changed subtly. Phone settings were adjusted. Routes were altered. He paid closer attention to cameras, entrances, and exits in places they had visited before. These actions were automatic, driven by years of training. To him, preparation felt logical. To anyone else, it would have appeared obsessive. She noticed the distance growing. His voice grew shorter, his responses colder. The warmth she once felt was replaced by caution. Still, she held on to hope, believing stress was temporary. She told herself that once the holiday passed, things would return to how they were. She did not realize that he was already thinking beyond that date. Inside his mind, a dangerous shift occurred. Problems were no longer emotional dilemmas but operational challenges. He convinced himself that decisive action was the only way to restore balance. The idea of ending the relationship openly felt like surrender. He feared questions, accusations, and consequences he could not control. Silence seemed safer. The days leading up to Valentine's Day felt heavy with unspoken tension. She counted the hours, imagining reassurance. He counted risks, imagining exposure. Both moved forward unaware that they were no longer walking the same path. One believed in resolution through honesty. The other believed in resolution through erasure. Valentine's Day arrived with a sense of normalcy that masked what was already in motion. The city followed its routines, traffic flowed, and celebrations unfolded quietly behind closed doors. On the surface, nothing appeared different. Yet beneath that ordinary rhythm, a plan that had been forming for weeks reached its final stage. The officer moved through the day with practiced calm, following habits that revealed nothing unusual to those around him. His experience shaped every action. Years on the force had taught him how attention worked, where it lingered, and how easily it could be redirected. He understood patterns, blind spots, and the importance of timing. These were tools he had once used to protect others. Now they served a darker purpose. The confidence that came from authority gave him the belief that he could manage the outcome. The meeting that day was arranged carefully, framed as routine and harmless. Locations were chosen for privacy rather than comfort. Surveillance coverage was noted, not avoided entirely, but accounted for. Movements were deliberate, designed to blend into normal activity. Nothing about the setup suggested urgency or chaos. It was controlled, quiet, and intentional. What followed did not involve sudden emotion or visible struggle. Evidence later indicated preparation rather than impulse. The environment showed signs of careful handling, not panic. The officer relied on his knowledge to minimize trace and confusion. Every step was guided by calculation, not anger. The decision had already been made long before that day arrived. As evening approached, the absence became noticeable. Messages went unanswered. Calls went directly to silence. Friends assumed delays, busy schedules, or misunderstandings. No alarm was raised immediately. The officer's position offered credibility to any explanation he chose to provide. His demeanor remained steady, his story simple and confident. When concern finally surfaced, it was met with reassurance. He presented himself as cooperative and calm, reinforcing the idea that nothing was wrong. His familiarity with investigative processes allowed him to anticipate questions before they were asked. Early responses shaped assumptions, slowing the urgency that might have otherwise followed. Meanwhile, traces of the truth remained hidden in plain sight. Digital records, movement patterns, and environmental details quietly preserved the reality of what had happened. These fragments did not speak immediately. They waited. Systems designed to record daily life had captured moments that would later gain meaning. As night fell, the city continued celebrating love, unaware that a life had ended and another had crossed a point of no return. The officer returned to his routines, confident that control had been restored. To him, the risk had been eliminated. The problem had been solved. What he failed to understand was that control is temporary, and silence rarely lasts. The very skills that made him effective at his job had created a trail he believed he had erased. Valentine's Day ended quietly, but its consequences had only begun to surface. The investigation began slowly, almost cautiously. At first, the disappearance was treated as a personal matter rather than a crime. Given her immigrant status and limited social circle, authorities considered the possibility that she had left voluntarily. Paperwork delays, travel plans, and misunderstandings were all explored before darker explanations were entertained. The officer's position added another layer of hesitation. His calm cooperation and professional familiarity with procedure helped steer early assumptions away from suspicion. That direction changed as inconsistencies emerged. Surveillance footage from public areas revealed movement patterns that did not align with the timeline provided. Phone records showed activity that abruptly stopped without explanation. Location data placed both individuals in the same area longer than expected. None of these details were definitive alone, but together they formed a troubling pattern. Investigators began revisiting earlier conclusions with a more critical lens. Attention shifted to the officer's behavior in the days following Valentine's Day. His routines appeared intact, yet subtle deviations stood out to those trained to notice them. He avoided certain locations without clear reason and altered his schedule unexpectedly. These changes, while minor, suggested awareness rather than confusion. Experience that once allowed him to blend in now made him predictable to those who understood the same systems. Digital forensics deepened the case. Deleted messages, altered settings, and unusual gaps in data raised red flags. Attempts to clean digital footprints rarely erase everything, and remnants remained buried in backups and system logs. Investigators reconstructed sequences that revealed preparation rather than coincidence. The absence of panic indicators further contradicted the narrative of an accidental disappearance. As scrutiny increased, the shield of authority weakened. Internal reviews began quietly, ensuring procedures were followed without bias. Colleagues struggled with disbelief, but evidence demanded attention. The idea that someone trained to uphold the law could manipulate it challenged deeply held assumptions. Still, facts outweighed loyalty. Public pressure soon followed. Media coverage questioned why the case had progressed so slowly. Advocacy groups highlighted the vulnerability of immigrants involved in secret relationships with powerful figures. What had once been a private disappearance became a symbol of imbalance and unchecked authority. The story shifted from mystery to potential abuse of power. Physical evidence, though limited, supported the digital trail. Environmental clues confirmed timelines investigators had reconstructed. Each discovery narrowed the range of plausible explanations. The officer's statements were re-examined, and discrepancies became impossible to ignore. Confidence that once disarmed suspicion now appeared rehearsed. By the time formal charges were considered, the narrative had fully reversed. The case was no longer about a missing person but about accountability. The investigation exposed not only a crime, but a system tested by trust placed in the wrong hands. Valentine's Day, once dismissed as a coincidence, became central to understanding motive and intent. The truth, delayed but intact, had finally begun to surface. Once charges were filed, the officer's identity shifted overnight. The badge that had once commanded trust now drew scrutiny. His arrest sent shockwaves through the department and the wider community. Years of service were reduced to a single accusation that overshadowed everything else. The case moved forward methodically, driven by evidence rather than reputation. Each procedural step stripped away the protection his position once provided. In court, the focus remained on patterns rather than personalities. Prosecutors outlined how authority had shaped access, control, and opportunity, The timeline was rebuilt with precision, showing how preparation replaced spontaneity. Digital records, location data, and behavioral analysis converged into a clear sequence of events. The absence of emotional chaos became a critical point, suggesting intent rather than accident. The holiday that symbolized affection was reframed as a deadline driven by fear. The victim's life was reconstructed through documents, routines, and the small traces she left behind. Her efforts to build stability, her isolation, and her reliance on a man she believed would protect her were presented without exaggeration. The simplicity of her goals contrasted sharply with the complexity of the deception surrounding her. What emerged was not just a crime, but a portrait of imbalance that had grown unchecked. The defense attempted to shift attention toward stress, age, and circumstance. Those arguments faltered against the consistency of the evidence. Preparation had left a signature that could not be dismissed as coincidence. The court emphasized responsibility over sympathy, noting that knowledge of the law increased accountability rather than reduced it. Authority, when misused, amplified harm. As the verdict was delivered, the outcome felt inevitable. The officer was found guilty, and the sentence reflected both the severity of the crime and the breach of public trust. The decision marked a definitive end to a career once defined by control. His fall was not sudden, but complete. The systems he had relied upon had held him to the same standard he once enforced. Beyond the courtroom, the case left lasting consequences. The department faced internal reckoning, revising oversight and addressing blind spots exposed by loyalty and assumption. Community trust required rebuilding. Advocacy efforts grew stronger, focusing on the vulnerability of immigrants entangled in secret relationships with powerful figures. The story became a reference point for discussions about authority, consent, and silence. The victim's name endured through remembrance rather than spectacle. Her life, though cut short, reshaped policies and awareness. Valentine's Day would no longer pass without reflection for those who followed the case. It stood as a reminder that control disguised as care can be deadly, and that truth, even when delayed, has a way of surfacing. The end did not restore what was lost, but it ensured that the silence did not prevail.